Hey guys, welcome to Physical Geography. And in this class, we'll be talking about biomes, which is part of biogeography. We can start with a painting and a quote. This is a quote from one of America's most famous naturalists. You could call him an early environmentalist. His name is John Muir. And he traveled all over the Western United States, especially California, during the 1800s and early 1900s. And the quote is, "When one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world." And that idea of connectivity, that everything is connected, you pull on one thing, you find it's connected to everything else, is the idea behind an ecosystem. So ecosystems are communities, connected communities of living and non-living things that interact in a particular area. So this is a rainforest ecosystem in this picture. And the living things in an ecosystem are called the biotic elements, and then the non-living things are called the abiotic elements. The study of the patterns of interaction, meaning the connectivity between all these elements in an ecosystem, is called ecology. If you have a mind that's sort of geared for connections, you might want to look at the study of ecology. Geography is also very much about connections too. So topics and subjects are about connectivity. We say it's sort of holistic, like a big picture. We see how everything fits together. So in an ecosystem, you have both biotic and abiotic factors. You have plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, other things too. But on the abiotic side, you have things like the soil, the air, the temperature, the sunlight, the water, all the things that are not alive but affect the ecosystem. The ecosystems can be at any scale. You can have an ecosystem on the tip of your finger, within a small area. It can be in a puddle. It can have an ecosystem. It could be an ocean ecosystem. But if we were to go to the largest possible scale, to the global scale, world ecosystems, the largest ecosystems that we'll draw are biomes. Biomes are just the largest ecosystems. And it's important to remember that biomes are classified, grouped according to vegetation, not according to animals. The animals obviously will differ from biome to biome, but that's not the way that they're classified. They're classified strictly by vegetation. So on this map, you see one way of classifying biomes. There's no like one set way. Sometimes you see a map of biomes, there'll be 6 biomes. Another map, there'll be 9 biomes, then it'll be 11 on another map. So there's no universal, accepted number of biomes. You can kind of cut up the world and chop it up into different biomes in different ways. When they classify these biomes, they classify them according to what that area would naturally be, not what it is currently today. Maybe it's changed artificially or something like that. Now it's full of farms, but it's saying that it's naturally this type of biome. So here's a list of biomes that we're going to be looking at, and we're going to do, kind of a run through the highlights of all these different sorts of biomes. We're going to kind of skip wetlands because I covered it, I think, in an earlier video. So I skip wetlands, but the other ones we're all going to take a look at, and we're just talking about the main highlights. We're going to go a little deeper into some of them than others, but just to get a feel for each different type of biome around the world. We're also going to mention some of the animals that live there and the adaptations. Biomes are not classified by animals, but just to give you an idea of what types of animals live in different places, among the vegetation, I want to just mention some of the animals that live there as well. So we start with the tropical rainforest biome. Tropical rainforest biome. And that biome has the highest biodiversity in the world. Over half of the world's species can be found in the tropical rainforest biome. And so you can look on the map, you can see that biome is hovering right in the tropics between the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, 23.5 north and 23.5 south. In the tropics there, that's where this rainforest can be found. Places like the biggest rainforest in the world, which is the Amazon. South America, the second biggest rainforest in the world, which is the Congo rainforest, Central Africa. And then you also have rainforests in Southeast Asia. You see Thailand and Malaysia, Indonesia, places like that, the Philippines. And when we look at a rainforest, the rainforest has 4 main layers that we can distinguish. The main layer where the most life is going to be the canopy layer, the canopy layer. So what's confusing is that top layer there where it says emergence are actually just like here and there. They're just, what it is that there's a canopy in the rainforest, which is almost like a roof on the rainforest. And in the canopy layer, the vegetation is so thick that it just all weaves together into this roof. So hardly any sunlight can even get through towards the lower layers. So most of the life in the rainforest is up there, up in the canopy, up top, okay, 100 feet up or whatever it is. That's where most of the life is, in plants and animals too. So what are the emergents? The emergents are like, here's the rainforest, roof, sort of a canopy, and then occasionally like a tree will poke out here, one little tree will poke out here, and there's little ones that poke out occasionally are the emergents. Okay, this picture makes it look like there's a lot more emergence than you usually see. There's just occasional trees that happen to poke out seeking sunlight, okay, like a random outlier, so that pokes out from the rest. Okay, but the big layer on top is called the canopy layer. And we're going to see there's an interdependent relationship between these layers where the top layers provide shade, and then especially ferns that you find on the bottom layers of the rainforest, they are very much shade species. They live in the shade. They need shade. So that's why they're good for house plants. And so they get the shade from above, but they also protect the bigger trees in a couple of ways. One of the ways, for example, is that those humongous trees, a lot of palm trees in rainforests. Keep in mind, there's over 100 different types of palm trees in the world. So, date palm, sugar palm, wax palm, coconut palm, da 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 da. Those huge trees have huge roots, and those roots, are covered in bark. But the rain in a rainforest is torrential a lot of times, and so that rain will pummel, really just wear on those roots sometimes. And the ferns are kind of like give a kind of a waterproof coating. They grow on top of the roots. They're slick, so the fern fronds act almost like a vinyl sort of protector for rainforest roots, so they don't get sort of eroded and pummeled by that rain so much. So what's up in the canopy? Literally, a lot of life. You have all of the different types of monkey species that you might have floating around up there, like those orangutans, proboscis monkeys, white-faced monkeys, so many types of birds. There's parts of Kenya which have 400 some birds in the same, wildlife area. You have toucans on the left there. In Central America, you have something called poison dart frogs. It's sort of a symbol of Costa Rican tourism. They're called poison dart frogs because they have a poison literally in their skin, their protection. You have air plants. Air plants are called epiphytes. The bottom right, those are plants that hang off of other plants, hang off of trees, rather than growing out of the ground. So orchids, for example, or bromeliads are examples of epiphytes, air plants that hang off of other trees rather than shooting out of the ground. Depending on what part of the world you're in, there's different species. Like orangutans are only found in Southeast Asia. Gorillas are only found in rainforests in Africa. There's no gorillas in the Americas. There's no gorillas in Southeast Asia either. An American species might be jaguar. Humans like to go on vacation in rainforests a lot of times, like to trek in rainforests. You can pay $800 an hour to go gorilla trekking in Uganda. And somebody in Costa Rica invented decades ago this sort of sport you might call canopy, which is basically there's many platforms. There might be 9 or 10 platforms up in the high levels of the rainforest, up in the canopy there, and you just zip line from one to the next. And the way that got started was that scientists were actually before that they were studying up there, and they needed a way to kind of like live up there for days at a time. They started building platforms up in the canopy layer that they could hang out with binoculars and make research and stuff like that. They started swinging across from one platform to another using these zip line cables. So you have rope bridges, you have zip lining. Sometimes there's little like cable cars that they'll take you through there. So all kinds of things to do up in the canopy to get up close and personal with these species. On the ground layer of a rainforest, it's actually pretty open on the ground, relatively speaking. There's more because most of the life, again, is way up top. And only 2% or less of the sunlight actually makes it through the canopy. So you have a lot of space in the ground usually. There's no grass. It's just stuff that falls down like leaves, dying leaves and things like that. And lots of bugs, lots and lots of decomposers like those leafcutter ants, which are down the bottom there. And on the rainforest floor, you can see up close a lot of the details of the vegetation. So one of the key elements of the giant trees that grow in a rainforest is that they have what's called buttress roots. Because remember, they're getting rained on extremely hard in a rainforest. and they're also very, very tall. So they have to stabilize. And buttress, to buttress something is to prop it up or to push it up and to support it. And so buttress roots tend to go very much outwards rather than downwards. See on the picture there? So see how those buttress roots are going out like this? These big, big, big roots going sideways very much to stabilize left and right. And then on the bottom, you see the ferns we talked about, ferns providing shade. They grow over the roots of the trees, over the buttress roots often. The rain coming down, it slows it down so it doesn't flood as much. It just hits those fern fronds and just trickles down slowly into the ground. So ferns are very good at slowing down the infiltration of water into the soil. And then there's the things that Tarzan swings on called lianas, woody vines that can take on all kinds of gnarly, twisted shapes. You see on the right there. And they grow from the ground, but they then get supported by trees. In other words, lianas are rooted in the ground, but they then grow up the sides of trees and kind of use the trees as support. So they're not hanging off the trees only, but they are using the trees to kind of want to wrap around the trees or up the branches like this, or lean against the trees, stuff like that. So sometimes it looks like it's part of the tree, but it's not. The lianas are separate species that live alongside the trees and use them for support. So the ground layer of a rainforest is where everything is falling down to. All that we said, all the vegetation, the highest amount of life is up in the canopy. But at the same time, when those leaves fall off and branches die and animals die, stuff like that, they're going to go to the ground. If you remember, we talked about in the oceans, they have the bottom of the ocean. It's called marine snow. All those nutrients fall to the bottom of the ocean. It's a lot like that. And so the bottom is called the litter layer, just like the litter, the stuff that's decaying and decomposing. And so one of the key aspects to understand a rainforest is that you have an extremely rich litter layer, meaning that there's so much organic material falling down to the floor. And then there's so many decomposers, spiders, ants, worms, all these different things that are munching and breaking this stuff down, right? Bacteria, and they're breaking it down super fast. Okay, so we call that rapid nutrient cycling. So rapid nutrient cycling means that when nutrients fall down from dead leaves and dead stuff onto the ground, it gets decayed extremely fast. Remember, it's super humid and there's tons of decomposers there. It's munched up, broken down, and then gets taken right back up again by the roots of those plants, where those buttress roots are sweeping out sideways, like getting nutrition off the soil. And so if you dig down deeper into the rainforest soil, you'll actually find it's poor soil. It's not good soil for farming because most of the action is up on top, on the top of the soil, not down below where typical crops, they have deeper roots that go down there. And that's a problem when people cut down the rainforest and then they try to put a farm there, which happens a lot, like in the Amazon. You cut down rainforest and then they try to put soybeans or corn or whatever. And they discover, surprise, that the soil is terrible for farming because all the action was on top and you just cut down all the species that were providing the litter for the soil nutrients. So as a result, they have to dump huge amounts of fertilizers and pesticides onto that plantation to make the stuff grow. Yeah, but jungles and rainforests, what's the difference? Jungle versus rainforest. A jungle often used to be a rainforest. So a jungle is an area where it's like a rainforest, typical rainforest type area, except some trees have been cut down by something. Maybe people came in with machetes and did slash and burn farming. That's a typical reason. Or maybe there was a lightning and there was a fire or something. And for whatever reason, trees have been cut down in the past. And then the vegetation is regrowing thicker on the bottom. So because in other words, when you cut down the tall trees that provide the shade, right, the really high canopy layer, all of a sudden the sun can now penetrate. Remember we said normally there's only 2% of the sun or less gets down to the bottom. It's very dark on the rainforest floor. But now, as you cut down the trees, all this sunlight can get to the bottom. And therefore, the stuff on the ground itself, the ground layer becomes much richer. All kinds of stuff can grow on the ground now because there's much more sunlight. And that actually makes it much more dense. These people are taking a jungle trek through a actual jungle, not so much a rainforest. In the background is more of a rainforest with the taller trees, and then the place with the shorter trees that are denser, right where you see the elephants walking through, that's a path cut through the jungle. So we have rainforest, we have jungle, then we have a third thing called cloud forests. It's a rainforest at a high altitude, usually up on the sides of mountains. And when you get up the sides of the mountain, you literally start to get into the clouds. So if you're looking from below at it, from lower elevation, looking up at it, you'd actually see the clouds around that mountain, and people are walking in there in the forest. And because of that, there's a permanent, constant moisture of that fog in the air. It's a fog forest, a cloud forest. And so everything is always gathering condensation, kind of like dew, but like all day long. And it's always moist. And so you have lots and lots of moss, lots of mosses. So, like I said, mountain slopes are a typical place to find these. And in terms of the human environment interaction, these are often places, the types of areas where people plant coffee, whether it's on the slopes of mountains in Colombia, the Andes Mountains, or in Costa Rica or Panama, whatever. Those types of mountain slope, little higher elevation areas, which could often be cloud forests, those are often places where you find major coffee industries. So we can move from the tropical rainforest, we can move out to the savanna biome. And remember, we had tropical rainforest climate too. We had savanna climate too. So the climate's kind of, in these cases, are really having a major effect on the biome, meaning the plant vegetation. And so the savanna biome, if you recall, here's a rainforest, and then it's like the next step over is the savanna climate. We had rainforest is very wet all year, and then savanna had that dry season, like a short dry season. And so this is what you get. You get savanna biome, which is a tropical grassland. You might have occasional trees, right? So it's not like a forest, but you just have a tree here, a tree there. If you do have a tree, it's often going to be near lakes or rivers, because that's all it can support, because it has that dry season. It might be 4 months of a dry season. There's no rain. So not enough to keep the forest going all year. 65% of Africa is savanna. So it's a major, major biome for Africa. One of the keys in the savanna biome, tropical savanna biome, is that it is not only grassland, but it's tall grassland. So all those really tall grasses provide lots of food for all those ungulates that we talked about in zoogeography, like zebras and impalas and springboks. They need that volume of plants, and so the tall grasses are what feed those guys. They have a name for what they call the big five species in Africa. There's lots of other famous species there too, but the big five in Africa that all live in the savanna, tropical savanna, are the lion, the elephant, the buffalo, the African buffalo, a specific subset often called the Cape buffalo, the leopard, and the rhinoceros. So this is the big five. And if you ask someone who's from Africa, like a Maasai tribesman or something like that, which of these is the most feared animal, it's actually the leopard, because the leopard is stealthy. It's more sneaky. Leopards will hide up in trees, and then they will kind of survey the land. And, when something comes by, they'll pounce out of there and jump down. You can see in the safari on the left, you usually get a Land Rover or those 4x4 style with the pop top, and you're allowed to stand up and take pictures, but you're not allowed to get out of the car for obvious reasons. But the people who are native to that area, the tribes, they're actually allowed to walk on foot through these parks if they want to. So from the savanna biome, you can go to an even drier biome called the desert biome. So you're going from the rainforest, it's really rainy. Savanna's got a dry season. Desert is really, really dry all year. And in deserts, there's obviously very little vegetation. Vegetation that does exist, like cactuses, for example, have to adapt to very low amount of precipitation. And the way they do that, in some cases, is they just store water inside, like a cactus, like it's a water tank or something. It's got water in the tissue of the plant, and it's called a succulent plant, plants that can hold on to a lot of water. And another adaptation is that they have very, very deep roots. And then a third adaptation would be the fact that instead of leaves, they have spines, like prickles on cactuses, because a leaf would provide surface area where it would be more transpiration. You lose moisture off of the leaf. By having more dense spines, you lose less moisture. And along the same lines, just the overall smaller surface of the plant in general. Just the plant is just smaller. Therefore, you minimize evaporation. And desert species have ways of retaining water too, and also ways of eliminating heat, getting heat out of their body. So the jackrabbit on the bottom left there releases heat through his ears. He's got these massive ears that he can unload heat. The fennec fox digs a hole to sort of get out of the sunlight and stay cool. And camels store fat in their humps, and they could drink 100 liters of water at a time. So back to the vegetation. In a desert, the life clusters around oases. An oasis is actually vegetation that surrounds the water. It's the vegetation that surrounds the water that's the oasis. The water is usually like a spring, for example, coming from an underground aquifer. We talked about aquifers in the hydrosphere section. So aquifers are the underground pockets of water, some of which have been around for centuries or millennia, or even longer than that. And then they provide the water, but the vegetation that circles around that, that's the oasis. And so that then draws the species like camels, to munch on that and to get the water too. But the vegetation is what makes the oasis. So from the rainforest, the savanna, and the desert, we can go out of the tropics to go towards the middle latitudes where we live, deciduous forest biome. And you probably know from living there that that means that there's leaves that fall off the trees, right? And that's a response to the fact that unlike most of the latitudes in the world, the middle latitudes have 4 seasons. Polar environments don't have 4 seasons, 4 full seasons like we have in the middle latitudes, and neither do tropical environments. They usually have 2 seasons, rainy and dry, or rainy and less rainy. You can imagine again, the colonial settlers in America coming in and just surrounded by all these forests, all these deer and bears and stuff. There was no shortage of wildlife to hunt, fish, things like that. So lots of animal diversity in the deciduous forest. And because it does have the 4 seasons and a long winter, you have many adaptations through the winter. For example, we know that animals hibernate, bears hibernate, so do some other species as well. Species will also store food, like the chipmunk, which stores food for the winter. And the chipmunk you see there can hold the food in its cheeks 3 times the size of its head. Is how big his cheeks can expand in order to stock up on food to bring in. So we go from the mid-latitude deciduous forest. We can head in the United States, head west to the grasslands in the middle of the United States, the mid-latitude grasslands, also known as the prairie. And in America, we call this the Great Plains. That's the area, Great Plains. You have the prairie of the Great Plains. And it's actually a dry area because if you remember from climate, this is a continental effect. We're far inland from the coast. So it's hard for moisture to get in that far. And so it's quite dry. This is the area of the United States where, for example, the Dust Bowl took place. The soil was very dry to the point where it started to just kind of fly away and people lost their farms. There's a lot of really, really heavy duty poverty going on in the middle of the United States. And so because these areas are dry, the continental effect in the middle of the United States, and also sometimes the rain shadow effect, like the Great Plains are in the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains, then the key thing about the mid-latitude grasslands is that the vegetation is short. The difference between this and the tropical savanna has long, tall grasslands, but the prairies here or mid-latitude grasslands, has short vegetation. Because it's so dry, it can't support taller grasses. So these mid-latitude grasslands or prairie are sort of interesting for farming. On the one hand, you'd think, wow, it's probably not that good for farming because it's dry. How's it going to support huge amounts of corn and wheat and stuff like that? But it does. It's actually the breadbasket of the United States. So how is that possible? And the answer is because, as we talked about a little bit in the hydrosphere section, we're pumping water from aquifers underground that's been there for a long, long time. and we're pumping it up and then irrigating these areas artificially. It is good soil when it comes to fertility. It's got lots of minerals in it. And so humans have now made the mid-latitude grasslands some of the world's most productive farming regions. And we have Great Plains on the bottom left there. We have in Argentina and also parts of Brazil and Uruguay and Paraguay have what's called the Pampas, Las Pampas, which is one of the world's major beef, producing regions, and now also other things like corn and soybeans. And then you have the North China Plain around Beijing. These are mid-latitude grasslands that are super productive and they sustain major civilizations. In America, if you were to have crossed the prairie, the mid-latitude grasslands in 1840, for example, you would have seen millions of buffalo, millions of buffalo. There's quotes from that time from people who crossed the area that, they started riding their horses in the morning, they rode all day, and the herd of buffalo alongside of them, they were, traveling past, it never ended. In other words, they just traveled all day and the buffalo never stopped. And so there's just that many buffalo, or bison, they also call it. What happened to them all? Well, basically, there was a period there in the middle of the 1800s. You can see pictures online if you Google, shooting buffalo 1800s. You'll see these pictures of all these skulls. They had guys go out there after the transcontinental railroad was created. People just went out there and literally just shot buffalo left and right, and then piled up their skulls in these mountains and stuff like that. It's incredible. So they literally just wiped the buffalo off of the Great Plains in a relatively short amount of time, within about a decade or so. Asia has a different experience with mid-latitude grasslands. In Central Asia, countries like Kazakhstan, Mongolia, all the Stan countries, Uzbekistan, etc., mid-latitude grasslands there are really far from the ocean, super far, because Asia is the widest continent. So these are people who live a nomadic lifestyle, and nomads basically live an animal-based lifestyle because they live in areas like this where there's so little precipitation because of the continental effect, that if they were to stay in one place with those animals, then those animals would just eat through the grass and no one would have anything to eat anymore. So they have to keep moving, hence the nomad life, right? They often have sort of a circuit that they move in, maybe 9 stops per year. And they have portable houses called yurts, that you see on the right there. And the house is basically like leather skins around a wooden frame. And they can pull the skins off and then fold up the frame and put it on the back of the horse, and they can move somewhere else. Some people still live this way, traditional nomadic lifestyle, but obviously not everybody does. There's also major cities in Mongolia, places like that. Nomads tend to live on animal products because if you were to kill the animal, then you'd have no more source. So they live on things like milk and often blood too. They take a little arrow or something, or they poke a little hole in the animal and then drink the blood like that. So all kinds of products that come from animals, from milk, from yogurt, and blood, and things like that. And that goes back to even ancient times. If you read what's often called the first work of history, real major work of history called Herodotus, is the Histories. He talks about the tribes of Central Asia who were nomadic, and he describes their lifestyle. And he basically says they followed rivers and ate fish, milk, and blood. Pretty much the same thing that nomads eat today. Those prairies, that prairie or steppe, the short grassland, which almost looks like a carpet from a distance, goes all the way across Central Asia, all the way from Mongolia, all the way through Russia, actually, and the stands, and even into a little bit of Eastern Europe, like Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons why Ukraine is a world leader in a lot of these crops, like sunflower seeds, for example, and wheat and things like that, that you just grow over these massive grasslands. So from the mid-latitudes, let's go up to more polar regions, the taiga and tundra. So taiga is a Russian word for snow forest, or boreal, meaning northern forest. Boreas is the north wind in Greek mythology. And so that's the largest land biome because it's just so large up there. The continents are so wide. That's where the continents are widest. So you can see on the map, this is extremely wide, and yet it only is found in a handful of countries. The big three: Canada, Russia, the United States are up there. But then also in Scandinavia, so you have Norway, Sweden, and Finland. and little teeny bits at the top of Scotland there you can see, and little teeny bits at the top of Japan. So even though the taiga is a massive biome, it's low in biodiversity. So there's the flip side of the Amazon. Amazon had rainforests with hundreds of species of insects in the same forest. This is like the same tree, like rubber stamped again and again and again and again and again and again. So you can see that on the bottom there, these coniferous forests with pine, cone-bearing trees, larch and pine, things like that. They just go on and on and on with the same types of trees for long, long distances. And I think we mentioned in the other slides that like northern Sweden has lots of taiga, and Finland and Norway, and that's where the wood comes from for IKEA furniture originally. That's the pine forest, stuff like that. So there's these conifers, these trees that have needles and cones. But one of the cool things about a taiga forest floor is that it's clean. It's the opposite of the rainforest. It's just kind of the needles fall down, right? And then they make sort of a needle flat floor, and it's relatively dry because it's not super humid like a Amazon or anything. So you can have very clean, floor to the rainforest covered in needles. So that's kind of a nice, environment to walk through. This same area, coincidentally, these northern parts of the world were under ice during the ice age. These super thick glaciers that are kilometers thick, they hold giant rocks in the bottom as they melt in the summertime at the bottom, and they refreeze. And as they refreeze, they kind of grab up rocks. They use that as sandpaper to scour the ground. And so they scoured out these sort of basins that form lakes. And so this is the real original, sort of land of lakes. And you see the same thing in Minnesota, in the United States. The Great Lakes were also formed that way. So Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. So take a look at the map of Finland there, and you can see that it's almost like cut up with these sort of capillaries going through there, all these little lakes that are carved out by ice during the ice age. And so that's to say that this taiga is not always found in these giant stretches. It's often found on these oddly shaped islands and peninsulas within the lake formations that make up a lot of these northern countries. So just as we said that the taiga has a low plant diversity, it also has a low diversity of animals too. The animals that do live there have to be able to withstand the cold. Often there's bigger animals like these brown bear and the elk, and they can eat reindeer and elk can eat lichens and things like that, little short, vegetations. The bald eagle can be found in the taiga. That's only in North America. It's one of those species that's unique to the Americas. So we say endemic to the Americas. And these species, often travel long distances. The reindeer can travel really long distances to find food. To find food, it can travel all across, sort of sideways around the Arctic, and then also make loops down into the deep interior of the continent because it is so big. So beyond the taiga, we have the tundra. Tundra is where it's too cold for trees. It's just the edge of the Arctic Ocean. So it's really cold up there, and it's really dark. The only thing that's going to be able to grow is stuff that's real short. So lichens, flowers only in the summertime, flowers bloom, fungi, things like that. And it's beautiful. It's often very colorful. And like we said, reindeer can munch on stuff like that. And they hang out along the coast of the Arctic Ocean, and that's their food supply right there. And so when it comes to species in the tundra, you do have polar bears, and you do have these muskox here, which have a heavy fur coat, so to speak. You use a handful of mammals like that, but not many. Zero amphibians. There's zero reptiles. Remember, anything cold-blooded cannot generate its own heat, so it's just going to freeze up here. But what does dominate life in the tundra in terms of like the number of species is birds, many of which migrate there during the summer. Many types of birds come up there to breed. And as we said, they lay eggs in a very short amount of time in the brief tundra summer, the months. They lay eggs, the eggs hatch, the baby birds learn to fly, and then they're actually able to fly hundreds of miles, thousands of miles out of there before it gets cold again. One of the birds that does migrate back and forth to the tundra environment is the bird that has the longest migration of any species in the world. That's called the Arctic tern. The Arctic tern has the longest migration in terms of distance of any species. And it basically goes from one polar region to the other. It goes from the Arctic to the Antarctic. And if you wanted to visit the tundra, one place you can do that is in Canada, far up north on Hudson Bay, is a town called Churchill. And so you see on the right there, they have the tundra buggy, which puts people up at a safe height above the polar bears, and you can just basically drive around in the tundra and hang out with polar bears safely inside. And last but not least, again, we're kind of skipping the wetland biome because we kind of talked about that a little bit, but we go to the coral reef biome, which is kind of different because it's in the ocean. And some people say that there's as much biodiversity in coral reef biome as there is in the actual Amazon itself. It is very, very high in biodiversity. And just to be clear, when we say that, we don't necessarily mean that the actual coral itself is high in biodiversity. It's saying that there's a lot of species that live in among the coral. This is zooming in very close. Basically, coral is built around these little coral polyps, these squishy, soft polyps, which, unlike humans who have an endoskeleton, where the bones are inside, and the soft stuff on the outside, the coral has the soft stuff on the inside, and the exoskeleton is the hard outer skeleton of the coral. So this white stuff on the outside is hard. Calcium is basically like almost like a piece of stone. Basically, it's calcium carbonate. So you put many, many of these polyps together, all with their little exoskeletons, and you make up a colony. And then you can have a whole coral reef built out of all these little individual, many, 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 many polyps in their exoskeletons. So that coral reef then provides sort of a structure in which other species can then live and dwell and eat, feed, and stuff around there. So the coral reefs provide the overall environment, and many other species live there. Coral cannot just grow anywhere. It has to be warm, and it has to have sunlight. So coral reefs are found typically in tropical waters where it's warm, and then not on the bottom of the ocean, but up towards the surface where the light can still penetrate the photic zone towards the top of the ocean. You see here the biggest coral reefs in the world, the Great Barrier Reef around Australia, Eastern Australia over here, the Caribbean. It's a massive region for snorkeling and scuba diving. And then Southeast Asia over here, they call that the Coral Triangle sometimes. And then the Pacific region, meaning like all of these smaller islands in, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia out here, even Hawaii up here included. Those are also a massive coral region too. So the coral reef biome is extremely rich, not just the coral itself, but all the species living in there. So that's a look at biomes. We started off by saying that, when you look at one aspect of nature and sort of tug on it, you can see how everything is connected. It's connected to the rest of the world. And that's true with biomes, right? We have a certain type of plants, type of vegetation, but that vegetation is partly a result of the soil and also partly a result of the climate in that particular place and other things too. And then the plant vegetation helps to determine the types of animals that live there as well. And so everything really is connected when you look at biomes.